Attacks can't be prevented, but they can be stopped. Modern cyber attackers have already made it inside your network, but you have the upper hand. Find and eradicate threats with ExtraHop network detection and response, and shut them out before real damage is done. Learn the advanced techniques attackers are using and how ExtraHop stops them with a live attack simulation. Register at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. That's extra HOP.
Can your incident response technology collect from off-network endpoints? Xtero FTK Enterprise can. Endpoints are no longer located in a physical office, and organizations need a comprehensive investigation tool that enables holistic data collection and review. With FTK Enterprise, you can also scan for IOCs and MISP indicators. You can scan with Yara rules, and you can use integrations to trigger automatic endpoint collections. Visit securityweekly.com/Xtero for access to their white paper, Incident Response for a Remote World. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your device. You can also join our mailing list Discord server and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms, which is YouTube and Discord. All right, for our second interview today, we're talking with Sean Metcalf, the CEO and founder of TriMark. And we're talking about Microsoft identity security issues. So Sean is one of around 100 people in the world. I just learned, I didn't know this certification existed before today, but the Microsoft Certified Master Directory Services Active Directory certification. It is a mouthful. Yeah, only 100 people got it because that's like you have to be able to say it without stuttering, you know. And
absolutely.
Only 100 people in the world can do that. You're also a former Microsoft MVP, and you've definitely made a name for yourself, you and your company, TriMark, focusing on Active Directory, Azure AD, and Microsoft Cloud attack and defense in general, which I've seen a ton of over the years. But welcome to the show, Sean.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. I will say that the Microsoft Certified Master Program, Microsoft actually closed it down soon after I got the certification. So that's one of the, I suppose, nice things about it now is that there's not going to be any more than there are today. But those who can say it probably have it.
Yeah, it's fun. I don't think I got a certification for it, but I took SANS briefly had a course on VoIP security, on VoIP hacking. And I took that. I took that course in the short 2 years that they offered it, but it was really interesting because you actually got a headset, set up an asterisk server, and you were playing with voice calls and stuff like that. It was very interactive. It was a lot of fun. Everybody basically had everybody had a PBX running on their laptop as one of the requirements to go through the course. So it was fun.
Very nice.
Yeah, so I think first off, we need to qualify, what we're talking about today with this title, because I think one of the things that's very confusing for the industry and certainly for me personally is the relationship between old school Active Directory, domain controllers, and Azure AD, and, the connections between all this and Office 365 and Microsoft Azure. So maybe a few words about that before we dive into any specifics.
Absolutely. So it's interesting because Microsoft likes certain terms. For a while there in the early 2000s, it was all about Active Desktop, ActiveX, Active Directory. So it just seems to flow very nicely. Now they're all about Defender. A few years ago it was ATP. Yeah. So who knows what it'll be next.
Yeah, we've noticed. And right. Changing product names every 30 days, it seems.
Oh yeah, it's crazy. So we have an assessment for Azure AD and Microsoft Office 365. We originally called it Office 365, so now we put Microsoft in front of it. Until Microsoft removes all references to Office 365, then we can adjust it again. But yeah, every year after the Microsoft annual Ignite conference that usually happens in the fall, we have to go through and update our documentation and make sure that we're recommending the right product names. I still say Azure ATP though, even though it's called Defender for Identity now, but everything's Defender. But getting to Active Directory, that's what we've had on-prem for a long time, since around 2000. When it was released, I've been working with it since around that time, and it's still around. I thought probably about 4 years ago that Active Directory would start winding down in 5 to 7 years, but it's I would say arguably more popular than ever now because of the problems that it solves. And I don't need to go into all the things that AD does, but it's a directory. It provides authentication. It provides management of servers, workstations, computers, as well as users, setting those security settings through group policy. So there's a lot of capability already built into it. And the thing about Active Directory is you don't pay for Active Directory, you pay for Windows licenses. So it's something you get as part of Windows. Azure AD is quite a bit different. So I usually don't say Azure Active Directory because Azure AD is not Active Directory. And that's probably the first most confusing thing. We've talked with companies and customers that are like, okay, I want to move and migrate from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory because it has Active Directory in the name. It's got to be AD in the cloud. Kind of, sort of. However, you can't just lift and shift from Active Directory to Azure AD. There's a number of key differences as to why you can't do that. One, there's no authentication methods that we're used to on-prem. So Kerberos and NTLM are not there. Yes, I know Azure AD has added some Kerberos for specific scenarios, such as Azure hosted file shares, but it's not the same thing. You can't just have a server and point it to Azure AD, and all of a sudden you can use your application by authenticating through Azure AD. At least not natively and not without adding something on, without having Active Directory as well. So this means that it's not going to work for the majority of the scenarios that Active Directory does. You're not going to be able to take your servers, join them to Azure AD, and then just have your applications work like how Active Directory does today. You also don't have group policy built in. So you're going to have to go with some sort of MDM, mobile device management system, such as Intune, in order to set those settings. And Intune is not group policy. So we've been trying to track and map some of the differences or deficiencies, as they are, between the settings that you can set, the security settings that you want to see in Active Directory versus what's in Intune. Thankfully, Microsoft has recognized this over the past year or so and has started adding additional templates and capabilities to Intune in order to be able to manage these Windows systems and set the security settings that really should be set. So a couple key differences right off the bat. One, Azure AD is a multi-tenant directory service. So that means that you don't have domain controllers that you're managing. And technically, there's no domain controllers that you actually ever see. Just like you don't have Exchange servers that you're managing with Exchange Online. They're out there, but they're not really yours. They're a shared resource. So there are some things that are very confusing. Certainly, the name makes it sound Active Directory, Azure AD. We can just move things over. Unfortunately, not. Azure AD supports web authentication protocols. So SAML is one of the core ones. You can use OAuth to perform authentication as well as some other web federation. So in order to connect Active Directory to Azure AD, historically you need federation services such as Microsoft Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS, or something like Okta or Ping. So they are very different, and I think the confusion comes in with the name for sure.
Yeah, if you started talking about Forest, I was going to stop you there because it's already triggered with the amount of Microsoft ease you're having to speak there. But sure. Oh man, it's yeah, I feel lied to.
Well, it's marketing, right?
Yeah. When it came in, it was like, oh, cool, like we can finally get rid of domain controllers, and then. No, it's adding on to it. It's like a lot of, I guess a lot of folks use it almost kind of like you'd use an Okta, as for SSO for authenticating with other solutions and things like that. Obviously managing your identity in Azure if you're a big Azure user. But yeah, you still have that on-prem management challenge and as you said, the legacy authentication protocols and stuff like that. Like even if you did get rid of domain controllers, you probably still have to have some component on site that would allow you to do some of the authentication stuff.
Well, you could use Azure AD exclusively. So if you didn't have applications that run on servers, so basically, the traditional approach where you have a database server, or SharePoint is the thing that a lot of people have had online. Of course, that's in the cloud now. But you don't have that custom application that you have to connect to with either a client app that's on your computer or going to the website that's running. Now, there are some solutions in order to connect your cloud identity into that on-prem identity. And Microsoft has really been positioning Azure AD as the identity provider, IDP, that works with everything. So you could have an account within Azure AD, and then be able to access lots of resources, not just things that are in Azure or the Microsoft cloud itself. So you can use that to then connect to things like Workday, Salesforce, even AWS and other cloud providers. And that's one of the challenges that we're in now is I kind of joke about this. It used to be that, and still is in some cases, you have an Active Directory forest or several, and you want to create a new one, greenfield environment that's pure and pristine and running all the latest versions of Windows and everything else. And then you want to migrate over to it. So from your 380 forest, you migrate over to this one. But there's always that one application that you can't quite get migrated over, either because it's old, or in some cases, the vendor's not around anymore. We've seen an instance where the vendor had hard-coded the license to the forest name, and therefore the customer couldn't migrate out of that forest. So instead of 380 forests, you now have 4. And now you have one more thing that you have to worry about or deal with. It's the same thing with Azure AD. A lot of customers have decided, all right, we don't want to run Exchange anymore, which I think is a great idea. Don't run Exchange on-prem. Move it to the cloud. Let Microsoft deal with it. Put it in Exchange Online. However, now you have another system that has to be managed. Azure AD is not a simple thing to manage and a simple thing to even grasp. There's a lot of a bit of a learning curve to go from Active Directory, what I've been doing for years, and I've worked with AD since 2000. It takes some understanding and some research to understand and really get what Azure AD is and the differences. Again, you're not using LDAP anymore. You're using APIs such as the Graph APIs in order to interact with it. There are PowerShell modules, so if you're comfortable with PowerShell for Active Directory, you can use PowerShell for Azure AD, so that's good. But a lot of the interface is a web portal, URL, web pages, and things like that. So there are quite a bit of differences, but now you have companies that have gotten Exchange Online, and they have Azure AD behind the scenes. So anytime you've spun up or signed up for Microsoft Office 365, guess what? You have Azure AD behind the scenes. And you're probably using Azure AD Connect to synchronize your accounts and groups from your on-prem environment, your on-prem AD, over into Azure AD within that Microsoft Office 365 environment.
Yeah, so like it or not, you're stuck with it, right? It's
you
there
have it. Yeah, whether you realize it or not, you have it. And here's the other big challenge, Adrian, is that people have it. These companies have Azure AD. They may not recognize that they do. And just like with Windows and other Microsoft products, the security defaults are not always the best for security. They're meant to be more open and available. So by default in Azure AD, users can register applications. They can consent to applications, which means that when they get that little box that pops up and says such and such application wants to access your profile, read your email, read your data, and they go, yes, that's fine. They can do that because by default in Azure AD, they can go ahead and click on that accept. Microsoft has added some capability, some very granular capability where you can only allow users to do that for low risk type permissions, as well as combined with applications that Microsoft knows about or in their partner network and by reputable companies. But that's a setting that has to be set. It's not the default today. And it takes a while for Microsoft to convert from those, let's say, those settings that probably aren't ideal to things that are much better from a security perspective.
So when you're thinking about improving your, talking about the defaults not being ideal, do you tackle Azure AD and Active Directory as one piece in Office 365? Like, is it even possible to break those down into separate things, or do people just have to?
It kind of has to be, unfortunately. I like to say that Active Directory is that service in the environment that is probably one of the best products Microsoft has ever created. And I know a lot of people are Probably shaking their head, no, Sean, it's not. But it is, because if you think about it, as long as you have a few domain controllers in the environment, it will keep running and keep operating. And I think that's part of the reason why we've had the security, or many of the security issues we've had to this point is AD keeps working. I don't need people to focus on it. And actually, the opposite is true. You need an identity team. You need people and folks that understand Active Directory and Azure AD, and they may not be the same team depending on the size of the environment. Our largest customers have teams or people dedicated to Active Directory and dedicated to Azure AD because they are different. They're different skill sets. On the Trimark team, we have an identity security team, which is comprised of people that understand Active Directory and Azure AD very well, but we still have discrete assessment offerings for each because Active Directory is different than Azure AD. The tools are different. The way you interact with it, the things you're looking for are different too. In Active Directory, we had a problem with service counts being highly privileged for years because someone went in and added it to domain admins. In Azure AD, now we have service principals and applications, which are paired effectively, but there are situations where an application can have permissions or a service principal can have permissions. And these permissions can be very granular, similar to Active Directory, but they're not always obvious. There are some permissions in there like directory rewrite all in Azure AD. That effectively means you're a global admin, and that means you have full admin rights to the entire tenant. So any applications that have those rights within Azure AD are, for all intents and purposes, system, full admin within that environment. And then there's some others that enable the application, the permission to even change the membership of your global admin role or other roles that are very highly privileged. So there are some interesting things there from the permission standpoint, which aren't as obvious necessarily as they may be in Active Directory. But I think the analogy is good enough that in Active Directory, you have permissions, and in Azure AD, you have permissions, and they're similar insofar as these permissions provide rights to accounts or something that then enables them to be able to do things in the environment that could be dangerous if an attacker could gain access to those.
So I guess, I imagine there's kind of a, how do you find all these issues? Obviously, that's what you guys specialize in, and I've seen you guys have tools for finding the kind of top stuff, But are there things that traditionally get missed even by people, running traditional scanning tools, vulnerability scanning tools, and things like that are just kind of no brainer? Like nobody, I remember, this is not my forte, but back when I was running a company. When I founded a company, we used Office 365, and my co-founder was very Microsoft savvy. And the first thing he did is he created admin accounts that we would only log into for doing certain things, and he split out all the all the privileges. So our normal user accounts could not do that much in our environment, and we only ever had 2 employees. So it was. It's maybe overkill for what we were doing, but are there any kind of no-brainer things like that people miss that kind of commonly get them in hot water?
Absolutely. And the tooling is getting better. I mean, Pingcastle and Bloodhound are 2 tools that have been out there for a while for helping to get a better understanding of Active Directory security. Both tools have been enhanced to support Azure AD as well, and to look for some of the issues that are commonly there. I would say definitely controlling users from being able to consent to applications. That's a big way that attackers are going after accounts. Can be combined with phishing, where they're popping up and saying, "Hey, this is the application," and if you're at XYZ University, they'll just have it as XYU University and phish them and say, "This is this new application that we're pushing out. You just click accept because this is real and legit." And unfortunately,
I'm Microsoft support,
right? Or even it's the university support, and part of the challenge here is that we as the IT have trained our users to click on links from when the web really started and email started in these networks and in these corporate environments. And it's been reinforced for the past 10 to 20 years even. So now we're telling users, don't click on links, be careful about the links that you're clicking on, or don't open attachments. I love the whole approach of don't open attachments or click on links from people that you weren't expecting an email from. Most of the time I get email, I'm not expecting that email. But if you think about contracts or finance, these divisions or even HR to a certain extent, they are receiving those emails on a regular basis and are expecting to get documents and open them. they can get overwhelmed with that, and then you phish them and you pop that message. Well, at that point, the attacker has a foothold. They can see and do recon for the environment, as well as have information about that user. And at that point, they can enumerate, just like Active Directory in Azure AD, you can enumerate a bunch of information about the users and groups by default. So there are some good things to lock down, but I'd say, to answer your question, the things that people aren't doing well yet is using Azure AD Privileged Identity Management to manage and control the membership of these highly privileged roles in Azure AD. That's probably the most important thing that you can do, second only to making sure that all your admins require MFA. Using push notification through Microsoft Authenticator is a very solid method to secure that authentication. FIDO2 keys are even better. But we still see way too many organizations that don't have, actually have regular user accounts that are in highly privileged Azure AD roles or groups, and aren't using something like PIM to control those group memberships, those role memberships, because a lot of the accounts that are in these roles stay in those roles. So if you're in a group in Active Directory, well, one of the biggest issues is you're in a group in Active Directory. Every time you log on and you're in domain admins, your account has a ticket or a token or both for that domain admin group. And you have those privileges all the time, everywhere. In Azure AD, at least with PIM, you can have a situation where I'm not a global admin until I go through the elevation process through PIM. My token gets refreshed. Now I'm a global admin for a period of time. And I can even enforce it where when I do that request, I have to MFA again, even if I already have. Right. So that's important to do. It's important to check to see what...
anti-foot gun measures, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other part of it is, I mentioned this before, that the web browser is what we're using to manage cloud. And yet I think most people know that the web browser is probably one of the most difficult applications on a computer to secure, because by nature it's connecting to all these sites that are untrusted and are running code in the web browser. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of attackers pivot over to the web browser, and we're seeing a lot of patches come out, a lot of vulnerabilities come in. It's been the history of web browsers, though. So one of the things I think is very important is, do not use the same web browser to browse the internet, be on Facebook, do all your social media stuff within a web browser, and also do cloud admin stuff. I would say have a separate web browser for cloud administration from your main one that you use. And I would also argue that having a private browsing session for your admin sessions and administration tasks is not enough, because a vulnerability for the browser itself could expand out to those other areas within that browser, which is why I usually recommend separating them. And if you think about it, you don't necessarily want your Active Directory global admin on, managing your entire organization from the same web browser that they're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and then clicking on those links to go elsewhere.
Interesting. So you would argue that just having Chrome with two different profiles isn't enough. You would use like maybe Chrome and Firefox, for example.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, because that's two different attack methods that would have to be done, or they'd have to know that you have a separate browser. Jumping from browser to browser, different browsers, is very complicated, because then you have to get into the system itself and get through the other security mechanisms that are there versus just that single browser configuration. A much better way, obviously, is to have an admin system that you RDP into, you remote into, perform the administration from there. But at a minimum, a separate browser is strongly recommended to ensure, and as I said, a separate type of browser to ensure that way, if there's any kind of browser vulnerability, you're not browsing the internet from this other web browser.
And the thing I really loved about having our account split out the way that Kyle, my co-founder, did it is it was impossible to do anything by mistake as the global admin account, because it didn't have access to email or applications, or like it couldn't do anything except admin type stuff. So it was useless for any kind of normal casual activities. So and it's a great approach, and we kind of see this evolution of administration and how things happen. I mean, with our tooling that we use for our Active Directory security assessment, we can actually go back and see the archaeology, so to speak, of Active Directory in that organization and how they've changed over time.
especially if the people have been there for a while. You see a regular user account, it's created domain controllers, it's created OUs, it's done a number of things. We can see that their kind of history stamps over time in AD itself, and can kind of track where they've changed, where they've evolved. Okay, they went from regular user accounts to now they have special domain admin account, or they have admin accounts, now they have domain admin or AD admin accounts. Azure AD is going through the same evolution, and unfortunately, companies are making a lot of the same mistakes in Azure AD and in the cloud that they did on-prem, because their need to get there. Executives are saying you've got to get into the cloud, make sure that this gets rolled out, and operations and security are trying to keep up with what do we need to do there. And then the other thing that's interesting is Active Directory has been around for 22 years. There are minimal updates to AD when a new version of Windows comes out. Yeah. Well, technically it was out before that while in beta, but yes, it was Windows 2000 was released, I believe, January or February of 2000. So yeah, we are 20 years in, 22 years in now. And
it feels a lot longer. I'm going to be honest.
I sure, right.
It feels a whole lot longer.
So what we're looking at is the maturity of the system, and there's minimal updates that happen. Azure AD is getting updated all the time. I mean, we have dynamic groups, we have custom Azure AD roles. Now we have the ability through role-based assignment groups or role assignment groups to have people or accounts in a group that then is now eligible through PIM to be a global admin, or eligible through PIM to be an application administrator, or things like that. And Microsoft is rolling out new Azure AD roles. So one that was rolled out in early 2020 was the hybrid identity administrator role. And we go through and check to see what roles have come out every quarter or so. And we noticed this, and we're like, this role seems very highly privileged. And so we reached out to Microsoft in 2021 to say, look, there looks like there's too many rights in this role. It seems like it's way too much. Second only to global admin, this one role that no one knows about. And Microsoft has 9 roles that they say these are very highly privileged. Be very careful who you put in these roles. And hybrid identity administrator role was not captured as part of those recommendations or that additional scrutiny. So working with Microsoft over the past year and a half almost, Microsoft has been paring back that role to make sure it can still do what it needs to, but isn't as highly privileged. So that's the other kind of challenge with the cloud is it's always evolving, constantly evolving, and there's new things being rolled out. And the knowledge and understanding of that is a lot more difficult than a 20-year-old, 22-year-old system like Active Directory that's matured to the point where there's not a lot of updates that are happening.
Yeah, I think, it's an interesting anecdote because I think a lot of the Azure vulnerabilities, especially the cross-tenant breaking vulnerabilities we've seen come out this year, has shaken up some confidence in Microsoft on the security side. And I suspect the Azure AD side is somewhat different from like Azure proper, but sure. I don't know if you've seen the same thing. Like I've talked to a lot of CISOs who are just not comfortable using Azure, at least the cloud stuff, after seeing some of those.
The Azure IaaS infrastructure as service, or even the components of that. I mean, there was something about Cosmos DB, I believe earlier this year or late last year, where it was a security researcher identified a way to see other data in that shared database, which is about as bad as it gets. So there are a lot of concerns there, but it comes back to the root of trust, right? We manage our systems on-prem. We have Hyper-V or VMware, probably VMware, and we are hosting and virtualizing things within that. We know who's managing that, or at least we've hired people. We've had background checks. Our biggest concern is insider threat from that perspective, other than an attacker getting in. Now we have the cloud, and we have ways that people can connect into it. So we try to control our ingress points for our corporate identity, our corporate tenant. But then there's the component of it being a shared resource. So there are concerns there, especially when you start thinking around, okay, what are the services we're using? How do we harden those? We've certainly had conversations with customers around that. It's certainly a balancing act because there's certain things that work best in the cloud, such as big data, data lakes, things like that. But when you put the data into those lakes, so to speak, it's a shared lake of sorts.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges for me is just managing all my identities. And I'm not the typical person, but I've got 4 or 5 Google Workspace identities and 2 Office 365 identities. And then my Office software is licensed differently on different machines. And it's just, sometimes I work on a file and it's just gone. Like I can't figure out, like it's not in that OneDrive, it's not in this OneDrive, right. Because Microsoft has changed, like by default, they'll save your stuff in OneDrive. Like it's not even anywhere in your local disk by default. And it's one of the things I worry about is with all these, because at a minimum, a lot of people are working from home, and a lot of people are doing work stuff on personal devices. Mm-hmm. One of the things I worry about is how to make it easier, and maybe it's appropriate that the interview we had just before this, we were talking about the new secure enterprise browsers like Talon and Island, who I think are kind of trying to go after this, where it's hard to accidentally use the wrong browser or the wrong account for something, where you enforce, what network connection or what device you can do certain things from. Because right now it's just super easy to get mixed up and put the wrong data in the wrong place.
Well, you're absolutely right. You have different identities depending on what you're doing. You might have an identity because you're taking classes at night, plus the fact that you have a job, a 9-to-5 job or so that you're working, plus you may be a volunteer for another organization, plus you may have another job potentially that you're working as well. So that's 4 different identities. And if they're all on the same platform, like Microsoft Office 365, where do you put all those? Certainly Firefox has things like containers that you can break those out into different, almost like mini instances within the browser. So you can have those identities in the same browser, but still it is very difficult to maintain and manage that. And I think that is probably the big newer challenge, since we have so much remote work from home types setups, especially with people using their own devices, which is cheaper for the company. And then they can just use a SSL VPN, so to speak, where they just come in through their web browser and then do work. But then, of course, it's always about the web browser. I had talked to DEF CON a number of years ago about attacking the web browser and basically pushing out. So Google Chrome, for example, has GPO extensions that you can push out through Active Directory group policy. And so you can actually manage that and also manage what extensions get configured with the browser. And so
a lot of people don't know about that.
Yeah. So one of the things I talked about in the talk, I believe it's 2018, about attacking administration itself at Black Hat and DEF CON and DerbyCon, was around how you could push out malicious extensions to all the Google Chrome browsers in the environment. And it's not just Google, but that was my example. And an extension doesn't have to even show that it's there. And the fact that these, when you authenticate in, so if you're an Azure AD admin and you authenticate to Azure AD in the web browser, you get a token, which usually is good for about an hour, and then it refreshes. So within that hour period, or potentially longer, an attacker could extract that. And if they have an extension on that browser, then they would be able to extract that because it's effectively typically stored as a cookie. Take that, extract it, drop it somewhere else, and use it in another browser and impersonate that user for that hour or potentially longer. So that's an issue, and that's something that's happening a lot, especially now, because you have so much cloud stuff that people are managing, AWS systems, Azure, et cetera, and that's where data is now. I did a talk last year where I was talking about cloud attacks and things like that. And there's an old quote that's attributed to Willie Sutton, but apparently it wasn't his. But it was basically, why do you rob banks? And he said that's where the money is. So why are attackers pivoting to cloud? That's where the data is. That's where all the important things are. And I'm expecting to see ransomware pivot over, because in many ways, cloud is easier from a ransomware perspective because the APIs are all there. So it would be easier from that perspective, which means it's even more important to protect administration for the cloud, make sure that we've locked things down appropriately, and we have the appropriate controls in place that are not burdensome for operations.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, the way attackers go about getting paid, used to take a lot of steps on the, once they got the data, when they were going after payment data, stuff like that, credit cards, it was a lot of work after you got the data to turn that into money. You would have to buy iPhones and with these stolen credit cards and then resell them somehow, and it was just a multi-step process. And then they found extortion, and once you've got access to the data, it's like a two-step process, right? It's ransom note, wait till you get paid. But on the front end, it's almost like a lot of these extortion situations look like a typical pen test where they're, phishing somebody, dumping creds, taking over, getting DA, then rolling out their ransomware to everything. It's a multi-step process, right? Like you've got to break in, pivot. And, I think what you're talking about is moving that side of it to less steps, which, with most of the things in the cloud, having APIs, SaaS-based, there's an opportunity there to only do things in a couple steps. And like one of the things I've become aware of fairly recently is that there are marketplaces for selling like OAuth keys, to people's Slack instances, to different things like that, where you have some kind of persistent key stored in the browser cache, and somehow attackers steal it and then they sell it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the 2018 timeframe, I believe it was, Tim Malcolm-Vetter at the time was the red team lead at a Fortune 1 company, and we're chatting with Big Endy and Smalls about mainframe hacking, and the three of us ended up talking somehow, and we came up with this concept of the silly term
that's a dangerous combination. You three,
it's a really dangerous combination
about how to attack things.
And how to attack things, exactly. And so we came up with this concept of a fire sale from the movie Die Hard 4, where in the movie, my mom calls me up. She's like, "You know what a fire sale is?" And I was like, "I have no idea. What, everything must go? I don't know." She's like, "Yeah, but with computers." And I'm like, "All right, I got to watch this movie." So watch Die Hard 4. And then I find out that it's the concept is that you take down so many different systems, computer systems, that the overarching system crashes. So we had this concept that we put together about how to compromise Active Directory mainframes and basically the entire enterprise. Again, pretty much everything's Active Directory and mainframes at most companies, and how to do it in such an organized fashion, kind of like Independence Day, where everything is synced up to the right time. A GPO gets dropped, everything gets removed, scripts run, daemons run on the Unix side, and then all of a sudden the entire enterprise is locked out and has no access to their environment at all. And at that point, you could effectively sell it or rent it, or do whatever you like extort it. We submitted this talk to Black Hat and DEF CON. It wasn't accepted, probably for good reason. There was a lot that we were to talk through. So I don't know that we could have done it in a 45-minute or 50-minute talk. But it was pretty interesting, especially when we started getting into it. We had several multi-hour sessions about how this could be done. And it was very realistic about how you could do this. And at this point, you could just throw in the cloud to that as well, like Azure AD, Azure, AWS. I mean, so many organizations have even multiple clouds because they don't want to put all their eggs in one basket. So now they put their eggs in multiple baskets. So you have Azure, AWS, and GCP, but all of those have to have identity sourced from somewhere. And it's usually Active Directory through something like ADFS or Okta potentially. And with a situation like that, as we've connected all these systems to make it operational so you can manage these systems from an enterprise perspective, we have connected them in interesting ways that make it easier for our admins and our operations to work, but we've also set it up so that attackers can take advantage of these connections. And that's some of the things that's been very interesting to me that I've been researching for the past year or two, and things that we've been focused on within Trimark as far as how can we solve these really hard problems of securing not just a single platform, but the interconnected systems around the environment. And it's not easy, but it's something that I think should be something that gets a little easier as we get better awareness and understanding of how these systems interconnect. One of the big ones that I've been focused on in the past number of years has been these hybrid connected systems. You have Active Directory, you have Azure AD, the connectivity of those two between cloud integration components. And it's not just Azure AD, it's also AWS and others that have those. If you have a domain controller in Amazon AWS, you probably have something like Amazon SRM, which is an agent on that system, especially if you use the newer template to install it. That's an agent where someone with rights within Amazon's AWS such as your admin, but someone else could actually run code on that system. Within Azure, it's very similar. And I did a talk at DEF CON in 2020 about that, where with virtual machine contributor rights, you could actually run a command on virtual, system virtual DCs within Azure, an instance of that. And in doing so, it would run a system on that virtual DC. So you could add a user or change something within Active Directory, that domain controller in Azure, and it would replicate back to AD on-prem. So by attacking Azure or the cloud,
right,
you could then affect on-prem systems and vice versa.
So the identity is too OP is the TLDR of what you're saying there. Yeah,
Right.
too much power in the
Yeah, it's too much power, and the identity is key. And we really have to do a better job of protecting these admin identities. And as you mentioned earlier, Adrian, earlier on, separating our user identity from our admin identity, and then making sure that we're not managing the two.
A little bit less convenient, right?
Right.
But
it's horribly
when you're the global admin.
Right. Everything works. When I'm a domain admin, everything works. So you have your user account and your admin account, and those are separate. So that's step one. Step two is to make sure that the admin account and all the systems that it runs stuff on, those admin systems, are separated from how the rest of things are managed. And that's where it gets really complicated and difficult.
So step-up authentication, I think one of the things you mentioned before is, not just having a single login event, right? Like if you're going to do something that's highly privileged, based on what action you're doing. And this is something I saw back with CASB vendors. One of the use cases that they talked about is, okay, your normal credentials, maybe you don't even use 2FA to log into your payroll provider, but the moment you want to change an employee's pay, or the source or destination of like what bank account their pay is going to, now you're going to be asked for some extra validation before you do that specific function.
You're absolutely right. That's the way that I think it should work, right? And through Azure AD, through conditional access policies, you can do that very thing. You can have a conditional access policy that applies to a group of users or even members of roles. And so that way, when you have a group of users that are your defined admins for a certain thing, they have to MFA from anything, from anywhere, in order to then do the next step. And maybe your users, typical conditional access policy we see, users don't have to MFA if they're on the corporate network. So that's sort of the balance of security and operations to make sure that works can still get done, but we have a better flow around checking that the person who is connecting is the person we believe them to be. And that doesn't even get into the MFA issues and potential bypasses such as MDM and some of the other stuff.
Yeah, MFA bombing. Yeah, all that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so if you submitted that talk to B-Sides Knoxville, I can guarantee it would have been accepted.
Well, I have to reach out to Tim and Chad now.
But yeah, it's I don't know. I wonder if they turned it down because it was just too dangerous, or But I think it would be a really interesting talk. Certainly we need to understand what's possible there. But
I can say that the good news is taking this without doing a fire sale type perspective. I am doing a talk next week at the Quest Tech Conference in Atlanta, and doing a replay of that later on this year at a Virtual Tech in December, talking specifically about what I call the identity nexus. And the nexus is an interconnection of multiple components. And so what we've done is we've taken Active Directory and VMware, and we've taken Azure AD and Azure, and we've interconnected them in interesting ways. And that provides opportunities for attackers. And it expands beyond that, but just focusing on Active Directory. So you have directory and you have infrastructure, on-prem and cloud. And just using those four boxes and then throwing in ADFS and PKI and a couple other things that you typically see on-prem, there's some very interesting scenarios there where user rights in one environment actually becomes admin in another, which then affects a third environment. And so this identity nexus is what we end up with, where these things are interconnected in unexpected and dangerous ways.
Yeah. Well, we have some excellent resources in our show notes. The Trimark Security website has all kinds of, not just guides, but actual tools, for checking your configuration. So that seems like a great place for anybody interested in learning more to go and check out. Anything else you suggest? You mentioned you're talking the conference is Quest.
Quest Tech. It's the the Experts Conference in Atlanta next week. There might be a virtual component of that. I don't recall. I apologize. But there is a virtual replay with a shorter version of the talk in December that you can sign up for virtually. We have a team member, Jim Sikora, who just dropped a 29-page white paper on how to secure Active Directory more quickly. And we call it 10 ways. There's actually more than 10 ways. But these are the things you can do more quickly and actually get done in a shorter period of time. Oftentimes, people focus on, okay, what are the most critical things to do? And you say, all right, well, you need to have admin accounts and admin systems and all this other stuff. And then their eyes glaze over. So we just published that on hub.trimarksecurity.com. It's awesome. There's no registration required. So you can just download it to your heart's content. You don't have to register. We don't need your information. So please download it and follow through and make sure that those easier things are done to level up the security of your Active Directory. Our goal is to do a webcast. We did that for Active Directory, to do one for Azure AD, and also release a white paper for Azure AD about things that can be done more quickly to help improve the security there.
All right, Sean Metcalf, we all need more quick wins in our lives. Appreciate you coming on and joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. It's been fun.
All right, we'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly Enterprise News.